85th anniversary. Wow. Let's hear it. Give it up for Pendle Hill. Yeah, 85 years we've survived and thrived. Now, this evening we're going to be talking about a great people to be scattered, but before the people can be scattered, they get to be gathered at Pendle Hill, and so we are delighted that you are gathering here with us to hear from Gwyn, to have fellowship, to have celebration. And actually, before we begin, I'd like us to take just a moment of silence, because we lost a real crusader today. I don't know whether you heard that Grace Lee Boggs, aged 100 and still going strong at the very end, died comfortably in her sleep last night. But she was a crusader for human rights, women's rights, the rights of African American and Asian women in particular. And so if we could just take a moment to recall that there are people who have been come and gone from here who've done wonderful things, and this is a person we want to just honor for a minute, okay? Thank you, friends. This is part 2 of our 85th anniversary celebration. Part 1 began yesterday afternoon with a celebration in the Art and Craft Studio with a display of items that were made from the Pendle Hill beech tree and also a Kentucky coffee tree. That the coffee tree had to come down, and the beech tree had a stress crack that prior to Hurricane Irene coming through, was prudent for us to save the tree by cutting a very major limb off, and we, through the foresight of Lloyd Gwyn, and the help of Hans Franke and all of his friends, managed to get the limbs milled into lumber, cured, dried, and distributed to woodworkers and wood craftspeople and artists all around who are friends of Pendle Hill. They have made items ranging from substantial pieces of furniture to little wooden rings, and so artwork and artifacts and furniture all are available for online bidding for an auction that will raise funds for our endowment. There is a flyer out here. The auction opened this evening at 6 p.m. for bidding and will close on the 18th of October at 11 p.m. Is the studio open this evening for people to go and look at the items live? There are also photographs online. And the other thing is, if you go to the front page of our website, it will tell you how to log into Bidding for Good, which is the service that we're using to do this auction. There are some wonderful pieces. Take a look either live and in person or online. This evening, we will be hearing from Doug Gwyn, but this is part of our regular First Monday series. And to let you know who's coming next month, our friend Jeff Dudiak, who was our Cadbury Scholar last year, will be coming to Pendle Hill to present on radicalizing spirit, Quakerism, and Christianity in the contemporary religious society of Friends. It is a long way of saying, can't we all be friends, and what does it mean that there are some things underlying our beliefs and actions that unite friends across our differences that are perhaps more important than those differences. And if we approach things from that angle, we may actually become a more effective force for carrying Quakerism into the world. So I hope that you will join us next month, November 2nd. If you aren't able to hear Jeffrey on the 2nd, he is also this year's plenary speaker for Friends Historical Association on Saturday, November 7th at 11:30 in the morning. He will be speaking. There's a luncheon and annual meeting, and then he will speak in the afternoon on the meaning of Quaker history. So coming back from Edmonton, Alberta, we'll want to welcome Jeffrey back here, either here at Pendle Hill or at Arch Street for the Friends Historical Association, or both. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Pendle Hill this evening and to turn the microphone over to our Executive Director, Jen Karsten, who will introduce tonight's speaker and also add her notes of welcome on this august occasion of our 85th. Jen?
Thank you, John. Hi, Doug. Doug, you've lived here in so many capacities. On which would you like me to focus? Dealer's choice. Okay. Doug's a friend. He's a friend to and within our religious society of seekers. He's a longtime friend to Pendle Hill, and he's a friend of mine. I asked him if he remembered the first time he came to the Pendle Hill campus, and he literally looked me in the eye and said, "It was a dark and stormy night." So I knew I was in for a story, but the short of it is that he was traveling in 1976 with a van of pastors seeking to become recorded in the ministry of Friends, traveling from Richmond to Philadelphia and stopping at the Quaker holy sites. Pendle Hill was one. And his next time at Pendle Hill was in the early 80s, 1981, when he called seeking the possibility of a teaching appointment or some sort of match, and connected with Parker Palmer and was invited to come where he was completing his doctoral studies at Drew, and they forged a friendship that continues to this time. Interestingly, well, for those of you who might require some reassurance about his credentials to take us safely through this lecture this evening, I can let you know that in 1971, he graduated with a degree in zoology. Make your own joke about how that prepared him for life at Pendle Hill. He says none of it. Finished his PhD in 1982. And I'm just going to go through a list of his various titles. Scholar in residence, 1988 and 89, teacher, 1989 to 1991, scholar in residence, 95 to 96, and my favorite, science, technology, and religion coordinator, forum program, 1999 to 2000, returning in 2011 to 2014 as a teacher. What I think we need to know about Doug is that Doug is a friend. He's warm, funny, faithful, insightful, dedicated. His record of publications is very long, and he's been sufficiently prolific to create this beautiful, beautiful history of Pendle Hill, some of which he'll share with us tonight. Doug Gwyn is a friend.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So yeah, I worked on this large tome, 500 pages on the life and times of Pendle Hill, called Personality and Place, and it was a labor of love, and trying to figure out what to say about those 500 pages in a reasonable amount of time this evening makes me think of that old Woody Allen joke of having taken a speed reading course, and then he read War and Peace in an afternoon, and he said, "Yeah, it's about Russia." So the long and short is, Pendle Hill is about people. And I'm going to talk about some of the wonderful personalities, just a very small handful, unfortunately. I do a lot more in the book, and those were just a small sampling of just the people I've met over the years that have made this place something very special for me, and I know others have similar experience here. The title of this talk, A Great People to Be Scattered. Many friends in the audience will know that that's a wordplay on a familiar saying from George Fox, who climbed the Pendle Hill in England in May 1652 and had on top of that hill a vision of a great people to be gathered. And indeed, in the next weeks, as he traveled around Westmoreland and Lancashire in the north of England that summer, thousands of seekers were gathering into this new Quaker movement, fulfilling that vision. This Pendle Hill was, of course, founded in 1930 as a place for renewed vision for a new century among friends and for seekers of many different kinds. And year by year, over the course of 85 years now, Pendle Hill has gathered many people and scattered them around the world in lives of renewed service and witness, so that it lives up to that title, A Great People to Be Scattered, as we think of 85 years of Pendle Hill's witness and service in the world. I titled the book Personality and Place because I know, in my experience from the earliest stages, there was just seemed to be a way in which personalities came forth and shone in a certain way in this community, in this place of 23 acres where amazing things happen among us, and how community and the regimens and rhythms of work, worship, and study together keep working us into something new. And that happens, as we will see from some of these stories, on very brief periods of time here, and others in longer periods of time. So, I'm just going to go through sort of chronologically, mostly, through some personalities that intrigued me, some of whom I've known, others I have only read about and read some of their words. But I wanted to start at the beginning with Henry Hodgkin, the founding director of Pendle Hill. Eleanor Price Mather, in her still fine little book on Pendle Hill, a Quaker Experiment in Education, called Henry Hodgkin an evangelical world citizen. He was a British friend, born in the 1870s, I think, when the evangelical renewal was still very strong in England. Became one of the founders of the Fellowship of Reconciliation at the beginning of World War I, and helped it also get started in this country with the help of Rufus Jones and others while the war was still on. He spent many years on the mission field in China, a leader of the YMCA in China, but also, even though he had this passionate Christian identity and spirituality of his own, he found himself engaging in interfaith dialogue with Buddhists and Confucianists there, and really expanding the whole concept of the mission field in China. And so he was this much admired sort of visionary leader among friends in the early part of the 20th century, when the group that was beginning to organize for Pendle Hill invited him to be their founding director. Actually, he accepted the call in 1928 and helped in the shaping of the concept of Pendle Hill in the next couple of years before it opened. Douglas Steere, in his unpublished memoirs, makes some wonderful descriptions of several people in the Pendle Hill history that I drew upon. And he was very involved with Pendle Hill from the very beginning. And he writes of his work with Henry Hodgkin as one of the finest experiences of my life. Here was a man who was a window on God, humble, clear-headed, wise, generous, and one of those most beautiful men I had ever seen. Someone had advised Douglas Steere to, in his prayer life, visualize Jesus as he prayed. And he had to admit that all he could come up with was Henry Hodgkin. Hodgkin was just in his early 50s when the Pendle Hill experiment began in 1950. In that first year, he taught a year-long course titled What we can learn from Russia is something like that title, and this was pretty bold to be asking. What can we learn from the Russian Revolution? What can we in capitalist America learn from both the successes and the mistakes of the Russian Revolution? And he was just a person who was willing to ask questions and go places that most people were not willing or able to think their way in that direction. But he had a very energetic first year, traveled a lot to build up support for Pendle Hill, and began to experience failing health in the second year. Finally, had to take a leave of absence after the second year, went back to England in 1932 to recuperate, but never did. He died in 1933. A real loss for Pendle Hill and the Quaker world. But Pendle Hill was, moving into the depths of the Great Depression at this point. and went through a series of interim directors for the next 4 years. And John, if you could bring us the next slide. Richard Gregg was one of those interim directors in the 35-36 year at Pendle Hill. Richard Gregg was the son of a Congregationalist minister in New England who had traveled to India to be with Gandhi and learn Gandhi's methods and convictions, and brought back the teaching of nonviolent work for social change. His book, The Power of Nonviolence, was published in 1935, the year that he came to Pendle Hill, and really popularized Gandhian nonviolence in America. He and A.J. Muste are really credited with making the case for nonviolent direct action at a time when there was a large pacifist movement in America, but many thought that it was just a little too aggressive, a little too coercive, and so Richard Gregg and A.J. Muste in making that case. Rufus Jones had helped Richard Gregg, probably guided him to Pendle Hill, also helped him find a publisher for that book, The Power of Nonviolence, and wrote the introduction for the book. When the book was republished, a new edition published in 1959, Rufus Jones' preface was replaced by one from Martin Luther King, and who credited him as an important shaping figure in King's work as well. Gregg enjoyed teaching at Pendle Hill, but found the interim director job a little disheartening, and so he left in 1936. By the 1940s, he ended up in Vermont with Helen and Scott Nearing on their farm, and began to explore more into organic farming. While he was still at Pendle Hill, Gregg was a major influence on a young couple that were teaching at Westtown School nearby, Mildred and Wilmer Young. Both came from the conservative tradition. One of them, I believe, Mildred from Iowa, and I think Wilmer from Ohio. And Mildred, years later, described Richard Gregg as, quote, a slight man who spoke with hesitancy that verged on a stutter, and we instantly recognized the voice of one speaking with authority. All his life, Richard Gregg would say the most positive things in the most diffident manner. So being nearby, they were able to make many trips over to Pendle Hill and really soak up what they could from Richard Gregg while he was here. It really became a turning point in their lives. From that influence, they adopted intentional poverty. In 1936, as he was moving on, Gregg was moving on from Pendle Hill, they went down to Mississippi to help lead the Friends Fellowship of Reconciliation's Delta Cooperative Farm, where they spent 3 years growing cotton with evicted sharecroppers, and then moving on in 1939 to AFSC's Little River farm community in western South Carolina, where they worked with black and white tenant farmers and teaching various farming and housekeeping and nutritional methods to their fellow farmers. They were there with their 3 children and stayed 15 years. But they would come back periodically to Pendle Hill, and Mildred would speak at midwinter institutes and other occasions here. And she also taught as a staff teacher at Pendle Hill from 1955 to 65. Her 7 Pendle Hill pamphlets published between 1939 and 1971 are gems. They're really some of the strongest of the entire series. I really enjoyed reading and studying her pamphlets, which I review briefly in the book. For his part, Wilmer was organizing protests against nuclear and biological weapons in the late 50s and bringing Pendle Hillers along with him, and was an organizer for a big silent retreat, silent vigil in November of 1960 in which friends and others circled the Pentagon in a big silent vigil for peace. November 1960. Wilmer was a key organizer for that occasion. Next, John. Pendle Hill's 4 years of interim leadership amidst the Great Depression finally came to a close when Anna and Howard Brinton agreed to leave their teaching positions at Mills College in Oakland, California, and take up the roles of director and director of studies, respectively. According to Douglas Steer, Anna, quote, came from an old distinguished Quaker family who had a penchant for living dangerously and following their consciences wherever they might lead. And Howard, he said, was a Quaker of deep insights who had a beautiful humility and whom you felt was all of one piece. Together they were a rare and wonderful find for Pendle Hill. Indeed they were. Mather characterizes that if Howard had a genius for clarity, Anna had a genius for strategy, and they made quite a combination, coming out of academia to a life that they knew was going to mean dealing with endless practical detail and personal nurture, which they did tirelessly and selflessly. Bernice Berry was a student in the 41-42 year while the Brintons were in their full glory. That's Bernice Berry, who later became Bernice Nichols, that some of you might have known from the board some years back. There she is as a teenager at Pendle Hill in the 41-42 year. She wrote a series of letters back to her parents in Missouri that are real gems that give you nice little windows on several people. And here's what she wrote in, I think, her first letter home in the fall of that year. Anna Brinton, one of the directors of Pendle Hill, is a fine executive, keeps the wheels of the school running, and is a remarkable wit. Howard Brinton, her husband, is the philosopher type, who gives the mild, peaceful touch to the excitement his wife is constantly at the center of. He's the sort of person you would love. She's the sort of person you would admire and respect and perhaps learn to love. Because she's been so encouraging to me, I hardly want this to sound unappreciative. Certainly, everything that I pick up from the Brinton years is that Anna did have a fairly autocratic leadership style, and that she was so good at it that people just let her get on and do it, and let her tell them where they needed to fit into the overall pattern. One of her mottos was, "Cooperation is the thief of time." And she really, truly felt that organizing everything for everyone really released them to get on with the work that they came to Pendle Hill to do, either as staff or as students, and that she was doing a great service. And Howard, commented that she was putting in huge hours, every day and every week, making this work. She served as director until 1948, when she began to experience her leadership style being challenged more and more. There was a new style of Quakers coming out of the CPS camps and the Friends Ambulance Unit that were interested and experienced during the war in more participational forms of decision-making and collaborative leadership styles, and she began to be challenged more, and Anna just astutely realized that the time was over for her way of running Pendle Hill, and she graciously retired and worked a few more years for the service committee and its international work. Howard continued as sole director then until 1952, with Dan Wilson coming on as his assistant in 1950 and eventually becoming the new director for many years until 1970. But when Anna died, they left Pendle Hill for Japan and lived and taught in Japan for 2 years. And then came back to Pendle Hill and finished. Howard taught for many more years at Pendle Hill while he was still able physically, and they both finished out their years at Pendle Hill. When Anna died in 1969 at age 82, Douglas Steer wrote another fine little profile for her memorial minute on Pendle Hill's behalf. He was chair of the board of managers at that time. He wrote, "Anna's often hidden gift of encouragement to individuals struggling to find their true course in life, her salty way of settling issues with a wry remark, her readiness to take on herself tasks that others might neglect or leave unfinished, her uncanny sense of knowing where sin might be brewing and heading it off far upstream." And all of this vast capacity, given willingly and with a full heart to our modest but deeply devoted undertaking at Pendle Hill, makes us bow in thankfulness at the gift that she was and in veneration for the life that she lived. And for more on the Brintons, I can certainly recommend Anthony Manusa's fine biography. Let's move on to Teresina Rowell, later Teresina Havens, an amazing character. Like Richard Gregg, Teresina Rowell grew up the daughter of a Congregationalist minister. New England, again, I believe. She completed a doctorate in comparative religion at Yale in 1933 and really became an outstanding scholar in particularly Eastern religions. She spent several months in 36-37 in Japan with the Ito-En community, a really interesting group that combined Buddhist and Christian teachings with a life of poverty and service. These people would go out and clean public toilets and sweep the streets and do other things, singing old folk tunes. And she spent that time there and came back to the U.S. And soon after her return to the U.S., she found her way to Pendle Hill. And she was staying in Upmeads, the Brinton home, newly finished in late 1937. They showed her to her room, and the next morning when they came down for breakfast, they found her already at work cleaning the baseboards of their house. So this was her Ito-En life of service still continuing. And then just at the end of that very same year, Eleanor Price Mather tells a wonderful story in her book of New Year's Eve, Teresina setting out on foot to Chester that evening, carrying no money with her, picking up a broken broom and beginning to sweep the streets, which is sort of the Ito-En way of making contacts and figuring out where the channels of service might be. So she was going about this, was thought by some people to be drunk, was taken in by a family that evening, and had a wonderful evening of conversation with them. She eventually ended up starting a little Quaker settlement house in Chester. A wonderful little experiment in 1942 is when it began with 3 former Pendle Hill students. They were given the vacant Friends Meeting House close to the waterfront in Chester that was no longer used, and they created a combination retreat center, playground, children's library, and settlement house, offering nutrition classes and other services. And they really found that way to create a kind of a bridge from the well-to-do suburban setting of Wallingford and the more working class and rough and tumble world of Chester. She just an amazing, and she's Well, meanwhile, she was still teaching comparative religion at Pendle Hill, and she kept these two identities separate. You know, she didn't tell the people in Chester about her PhD at Yale. In 1945, she wrote an article on the Ito-En movement that appeared in the Friends Intelligencer. And a Quaker named Joe Havens was so moved by the article that he wrote her a letter asking if he could come and meet her. And she said she was too busy. But he came anyway, and they were married in 1947 and left Pendle Hill for California in 1948 with their baby daughter. So they eventually ended up in Massachusetts, where she taught for a number of years. I'm not sure which institution, but they also started a Quaker Buddhist retreat center, Temenos, which some of you, I think, probably know of or have been to. Relationship with Chester kind of lapsed after Teresina left. And one thing that my book does is sort of chart the diverging social and economic destinies of Chester and Wallingford. But it's worth briefly noting that that the relationship with Chester was briefly renewed in 2002 when Pendle Hill recruited Elizabeth Ellis. If we can move on to that slide. Elizabeth, a Unitarian minister from the Boston area, came to start new work in Chester, and after consulting widely around Chester, began a program for adjudicated youth in developing skills, life skills, nonviolence training, and coming over to work at Pendle Hill in the garden and on the grounds and in the kitchen. Lloyd Gwyn and Carol Sciarra both worked with the teenagers on the grounds in the kitchen, and some wonderful bridging between two very different worlds happened that was lovely but short-lived. It died in 2005 for lack of funding. Let's move on to Fritz Eichenberg, going back to the 1940s again. Fritz Eichenberg was, well, I want to back up a little bit and say that the Brinsons, even though Anna Brinson had a PhD in art history, the Brinsons were very focused on Pendle Hill's founding vision of service and witness in the world. And they seemed to sort of keep the arts a bit at arm's length during their tenure as directors. But during the 1950s, both art and psychology began to become part of the life and teaching at Pendle Hill. And one of the initiators of that change was Fritz Eichenberg, who perhaps was able to make that change because he really had a powerful vision of art for the sake of humanity and as social witness. Fritz was born to a German Jewish family in Cologne in 1901. Grew up non-religious, but always felt a kind of a guiding spiritual presence in his life. He developed his gift as an engraver and emigrated to the United States in 1933, becoming a member of the Providence, Rhode Island Friends meeting in 1940. Fritz Eichenberg met Dorothy Day in this room at a Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement in 1949, a conference here on religion and publishing. And it was at that gathering that Dorothy invited Fritz to do artwork for the Catholic Worker newspaper. And he writes of that encounter. This was lovely. She looked at me wistfully out of her slanted eyes, braids forming a halo around her head. She was clearly made of the stuff of saints and martyrs, although no one realized it then. You couldn't possibly refuse anything without refuse her anything without feeling ashamed of yourself. I said, of course I would, but I'm a Quaker. Why not find a Catholic? And Dorothy said, because we can't pay. They became great friends that day. And over the years to come, Fritz contributed over 100 engravings to the Catholic Worker. And we have some reproductions in the reading room in Main House. Some beautiful work. He contributed the colophon, which has graced our publications and been in the Quaker Hill logo since 1949. For her part, Dorothy Day continued coming to Pendle Hill at least once a year for personal retreat and to keep up with her old friend Anna Brinton. So these connections are sometimes below the surface, but important in the lives of people with important ministries elsewhere and in other faith traditions. I can really recommend still Fritz Eichenberg's two Pendle Hill pamphlets, Art and Faith in 1952 and Artist on the Witness Stand in 1984. He came back, he was here sporadically over the years, but he was artist in residence here in the summer of 1981. The art as personal expression really took off more with the teaching of Mildred Tong from 1954 to 57, a British art teacher who was teaching at Bryn Mawr and began to do creative writing and creative drawing here. After she left, Alexandra and Peter Docilli picked up the mantle and continued to teach and advocate art here at Pendle Hill. Stan Zielinski created the first studio, the art studio in the Furbank basement. Sally Palmer began teaching art here in 1976 to 85, and then again from 1990 to 2005, and of course was very involved in the designing of the present art studio when Furbank was remodeled in 1993. Helen Morgan Brooks. Born in 1904, Helen Morgan Brooks spent 6 of her childhood years in an orphanage. She studied home economics in college and taught restaurant practices at the Cato School for Boys in Philadelphia before coming to Pendle Hill as a student in 1946. She stayed on as a dietitian starting in 1947. But her real passion was writing, and poetry was a part of her life for many years, and she's included in various anthologies of African American poets. When she left Pendle Hill in 1953 to continue her work on behalf of the poor, and in 1955 she published a book titled A Practical Guide, One Person, One Meal, One Burner, for people trying to live on a food budget of $5 a week. Even in 1955, that would be amazing. And part of her background for writing that book was the experience of feeding the Pendle Hill community on less than what turned out to be, I guess, less than $1 a day per person, using fresh, seasonal, and preserved produce from the Pendle Hills garden and orchard, which was quite extensive. First on the front lawn, and then after Furbank was purchased in 1945, the Furbank field area. She returned to Pendle Hill as a poet in residence in the early 1980s for a term, or maybe for a summer. After her death in 1989, Pendle Hill published a collection of her poems under the title I Choose Love. Jack Shepherd. Janet and Jack Shepherd came to Pendle Hill in 1966. Jack had been a sailor and then a journalist and then a playwright for the BBC for their radio dramas. He started teaching drama at Pendle Hill at that time when they arrived, but also it really began to take off in 1967 when he restyled the dramatic productions as the Apocalypso Repertory Theater. He said Apocalypso started out as a typographical error, but he began to see the possibilities. or doing drama in the apocalyptic days of the late 1960s. So it took off from there. He said they started out doing fairly orthodox, straightforward productions of Lorca and O'Casey and Sophocles, but he began to rework things more and more and invite audience participation, asking the audience what to do about this dilemma at this point in the drama. That started really when they redid the Oresteia of Aeschylus. He says, he writes about these productions, afterwards, each person, each player, and audience alike takes away something unique and indescribable, an experience gone deep, like a seed which will germinate in its own good time. We reckon ourselves well applauded when people report a sleepless night after the show. These, of course, were happening in this very room. In the autumn of 1970, Jack wrote a play from scratch called Fire, Fleet, and Candlelight, which finds Mary, Martha, and Lazarus 10 years after the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Mary has become a poet. Martha has become the agent for their brother's ongoing speaking tours. But over the years, they've all become tired, discouraged, and on the edge of despair. And Jack describes this performance that's worth reading. We played it in the barn to a visiting conference of about 200 nonviolent revolution activists. It had not been an easy conference, nor an easy day. It was late at night, and they were restless and not in the mood for a play. Mysteriously, soon the entire audience was part of the sufferings of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Innocently, we had touched on a nerve. Secretly, they too were on the edge of despair, not wanting to admit it. When we appealed to them for help, they could only share their own suffering with us. We could see tears on many unlikely faces. There are some who still to this day cherish a suspicion that we designed the play especially for that conference. But if there was any design, it was beyond our awareness. So you really find Jack doing much as the ancient Greek tragedians did, reworking materials that were already ancient then, to pose some of the ironies, and often painful ironies, of the city of Athens in its day. And Jack was doing that for us in our time at the end of the 1960s. Let's move on to George Lakey, who you might not recognize from that. That's probably mid-60s, George Lakey. Around the time when in the early months of 1966, 5 young couples with children came for a series of weekends at Pendle Hill. They would hole up in Waysmead, apparently, for these weekends, and talk about their dissatisfactions with the Society of Friends as it was moving into the 1960s. They called themselves the Backbenchers, and they published a small manifesto that summer called Quakerism, A View from the Backbenches. And it really offers a good sample of new, fresh, and radicalized Quaker thinking as it was beginning to emerge among friends, especially among younger friends in that decade. George recalls that the book appeared just in time for the 1966 Friends General Conference and quickly sold out, which may have been helped by the fact that Henry Cadbury, the noted Quaker New Testament scholar, bought a copy and carried it prominently around with him during the conference. So they had some endorsement from a frontbencher. New York Times also published an article about the book that year. And in the autumn, Pendle Hill picked up the gauntlet and hosted a weekend called The Frontbenchers Meet the Backbenchers. And the authors debated with leaders from the older generation of friends. They kept hitting the hot buttons of the day. That led on to the 1966-67 Midwinter Institute on the generation gap, another hot topic, and the next Midwinter Institute at the end of 1967 followed the Summer of Love with the theme, Can Quakers Learn Anything from Hippies? That gathering was led by George Lakey, Maurice Friedman, the world-class Buber scholar, Jack Shepard doing improvisational drama with the group, and Dan Wilson and others. Over 80 attended that midwinter gathering. Now Lakey, in 1965, had with George Willoughby and others, formed the Upland Institute at Crozier Seminary in Chester for radical social change work. And Lloyd Lewis, then associate director at Pendle Hill, wanted to bring something of that program to Pendle Hill. He first approached Lakey because Lakey was well known to Pendle Hill by that time through these conferences. But between Upland Institute and raising a young family, George was overcommitted already. But George Willoughby had suddenly become available because he was fired from Crozier due to disagreements with the administration there. And so George Willoughby took on leading a year-long course in the 68-69 year under the title of Preparing for Radical Quaker Living. And he taught that with George Lakey and Lloyd Lewis. It was a year-long course combining study of the theory of nonviolence as well as nonviolent action training, field trips, demonstrations, and street theater. However, that volatile course, which brought in a very lively young group of aspiring change makers, mixed with other chemistry of a lot of other young college students and recent graduates coming more in larger numbers than Pendle Hill usually allowed. And it was a especially large student group that year as well. And as George Lakey looked back on it, he said, "The previous period under Dan Wilson had been a time of attracting people to handle their midlife searches. That's a seriously different state of mind. People looking for peace and refreshment after service in India, for example, ran into very agitated young people in the dining room. It looked like oil and water. I couldn't see the mix. Nobody came to this radical living course to contemplate. They were getting skilled up for the revolution. So here's a boot camp for the revolution on one hand and a monastery on the other. How can that possibly work?" And indeed, it was a rather chaotic year. Concern began growing among administrative staff and on the board. Douglas Steer, from his board vantage point at some remove, was hearing reports that the community was breaking up into the day people and the night people. And the night people were keeping the day people awake at night, and then they weren't showing up for breakfast or meeting for worship in the morning. And the young folks insisted on having no more lectures, only conversation sessions. So things were really beginning to get shaky around here at that point. And certainly not all of this upheaval was due to the radical preparing for radical Quaker living course, but that course had a catalytic effect on the tensions that were already there. Willoughby, for his part, was already simultaneously working with the Quaker Action Group in Philadelphia, the Friends Peace Committee, the War Resisters International, and the AFSC, which probably made Pendle Hill look like a sleepy backwater by comparison. So he was agitating for much more participatory style of teaching and governance at Pendle Hill. Not surprisingly, the board, at some remove from all this going on, was more likely to hear Lloyd Lewis's concern about the stability of the place than George Willoughby's. And Willoughby was his contract was not extended beyond the 1970-71 year. But in early 1971, as the end was approaching for his time at Pendle Hill, George Willoughby wrote 2 open letters to the Pendle Hill community and board, raising some serious issues about the governance of Pendle Hill, an institution which he said he found hopelessly paternalistic, and suggested a number of ways that the board could invite more participation and input from staff and students. And surprisingly, within the 2 years after he left, the board actually adopted most of his proposals, and Pendle Hill made it through a big transition. While, of course, Willoughby and Lakey, for their part, went shooting off into West Philadelphia to start the Life Centers and the Movement for a New Society, which is probably where they really needed to go with their direction. So it's an interesting juncture, one of the really important junctures in the history of Pendle Hill. We'll move on to Parker Palmer. Pendle Hill was still in a lot of ferment and uproar in the early 70s. Lecturing was still being challenged a lot. Maurice Friedman finally left in frustration that for all that he could share with people, they weren't interested in listening anymore. And Henry Cadbury stopped lecturing, although he was very old by that time. There seems to be a real changing of the guard at that juncture. And along into that mix comes, innocently enough, Parker and Sally Palmer as students with their 3 young children for the 1974-75 year. Parker was only 35 years old at that point. He had been a student for a year at Union Seminary before going on to the University of California at Berkeley and earning a doctorate in sociology in 1969 under Robert Bella. And he was there for the Berkeley Free Speech Movement days with all the radical politics that came out of that. He went on after his PhD to work as a community organizer in the Washington, D.C. area with sort of white suburbanites. Began to feel burned out from that, however, pretty quickly. And that's what brought them to Pendle Hill in the fall of 1974. Searching for a community that embodied their values. It was really a major revelation. And already halfway through, before the end of 1974, Parker was offered the deanship, which kind of took the fun out of that student year, I suppose. But and it sort of sent him into a vocational crisis, realizing that taking this on would scupper his professional future in the academic world. He could see that clearly enough, and so it was a real crisis for him. And yet he began to realize, quote, "I was already standing on the ground of my new life, ready to take the next step on my journey. If only I would turn around and see the landscape that lay before me." During the free speech movement in Berkeley, he had seen the power of small groups, small circles, and how powerful that could be for personal transformation. But he also saw that it could be rather narcissistic and manipulative in some cases. He says when he came to Pendle Hill, he saw sharing in small groups in a more healthy and holistic and spiritual, respectful way. And it really began to fire his imagination for what education can be. And he was seeing Steve Stallonis and Eugenia Friedman teaching in this very dialogical style that inspired him. And he described to me how he'd been seeing this, and I had that Berkeley experience in the background. And then one day he was walking between the barn and Chase, and there was a plaque on the wall outside with a quote from Martin Buber that said, all real living is meeting. And he says he went straight to the house and started writing Meeting for Learning. his great classic essay, which appeared in the bulletin in May 1976, a Pendle Hill bulletin, Meeting for Learning, Education in a Quaker Context, which really kind of restated for a new post-60s context many of the basic principles that Howard Brinson had already articulated in his writings on Quaker education back in the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s. Perhaps it took someone from outside Pendle Hill and outside the Quaker world to look at this place with fresh eyes and be able to re-articulate the basics of what Pendle Hill does with such genius and clarity, and help us retool that, re-articulate it for sort of a postmodern sensibility. Parker was dean and teacher from 75 to 80. He and Sally took a sabbatical year, 80 to 81. They came back. As I mentioned early, Sally started teaching in the art studio down in the Furbank basement in 1976. They returned in 81, and Parker was teacher and writer in residence from that point. He unloaded the deanship in order to begin this amazing writing career that he was starting. Also, from early in his time here, his Pendle Hill pamphlet, A Place Called Community, is another gem that really nails what community is about here and what community can be elsewhere too. Many of you know how richly Parker has credited Pendle Hill in his subsequent writings down to today, and of course he's a widely read writer and teacher and founder of the Center for Courage and Renewal. I think an important figure in helping Pendle Hill transition out of the disjunctures of the 60s and early 70s. Let's move on to Charlotte Fartleman, who I think is really an underappreciated figure in Pendle Hill's 80s and 90s life. Certainly over the years, the art studio has been a place where people have integrated creativity with personal transformation and leading to new chapters of witness and service in the world as they scatter out from Pendle Hill. Charlotte Fartleman's Sink Down to the Seed, her Pendle Hill pamphlet of 1989, is a classic example of how transformative the studio could be. She was a student here in the 1984-85 year. A writer and photographer from New England, she had experienced an artistic impasse and spiritual crisis that brought her here. Working with Sally in the art studio, taking courses with others here, she really began to confront the fear that was separating her from God's love and from new purpose in her life. After leaving Pendle Hill, she went to Nicaragua in the 1980s, something that she would have been far too fearful to do before her year at Pendle Hill. She concludes, I learned my only real safety lies in following my inward guide. She discovered similar threads of experience among others that had been here at Pendle Hill as students or even conferees over the years. She interviewed dozens of former Pendle Hillers and wrote up her findings in a bulletin essay in 1986, Does Pendle Hill Make a Difference? She also taught for several years, one term per year, coming back to do that, Discerning Our Calls, which was really a wonderful integration of various Quaker and other techniques for people discerning what's next for them after Pendle Hill. The Pendle Hill experience also led to her founding the Lyman Fund, which resolved a struggle she had personally about personal wealth and what to do with it and how to put it to work for others. And she's helped many of us either come to Pendle Hill or take other ventures in faith and in service and witness over the years. She's made a great difference. And she gathered some of those stories together in a wonderful book that Pendle Hill published in 2001, Nudged by the Spirit, Stories of People Responding to the Still Small Voice of God. And one of those stories is the story John Calvi tells of his time at Pendle Hill. Many of you know of John Calvi. He trained as a massage therapist in the early 1980s and soon began working with AIDS patients, and then moving on soon from that, or adding to that work with women who'd been sexually abused and torture victims from Central America, Asia, and elsewhere. He was also traveling around the country to lead workshops as his gift began to be more widely known. But John began to experience burnout, and friends persuaded him to take a 3-month sojourn at Pendle Hill to rest and refocus, and he received, I think, a Lyman grant to come. And he did a lot of sleeping at first, as some do when they get here from stressful experiences or long periods of service. But through a combination of rest, regular meetings for worship, and spiritual nurture, he really began to restore his spirit and renew his ministry. And over time, as he moved on from Pendle Hill, John learned how to pace himself better, to take time off, and learn to say no in some situations in order to preserve his energies, and to discern those that he could actually help. He also learned the crucial role of prayer in healing work. Without prayer, both before and after a healing session, the pain that leaves the client often was staying with him. And he, having learned to avoid burnout himself, he now teaches others how to avoid it as well. John, of course, continues to come back to once a year, to Pendle Hill to lead a weekend. Whew. Well, those are just a few of the many stories that can be told, the many stories that you could tell of your experiences here, whether they were long or short experiences at Pendle Hill, and many more are profiled in the book. And it just shows, I think, how this place, something about this place and the reverence and devotion that we bring to it and that grows in us while we're here, does something for the human personality that enriches and inspires and empowers to new times and scatters us. I'm now scattered in Maine. So I think I'll end with that.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's always wonderful to hear those stories and see the connections. Every time we do that we have you speak, we learn new things, new connections. The Fellowship of Reconciliation is one of those organizations that grabbed me early on, and I didn't know of its strong connection to Pendle Hill.
Yeah.
Friends, we have a few minutes before we celebrate our 85th anniversary with some cake and singing to ask questions or make comments. We are live streaming this evening thanks to Julian Gwyn, and we also are recording this. So if you would wait until the microphone arrives, and if you would speak into it just about the way I am, pretend it's a little goatee attachment right there at the chin level, you will be able to be heard. whereas once you start to gesticulate and so forth, you can't. So are there some questions or comments for Doug while we have an opportunity with him this evening? I'm astonished. Robin, I knew you'd have at least one. I heard lots of comments coming from you saying that I was there for that. So tell us.
Well, that's very true. I was here on the staff for a little over 10 years, but I realized in reading this remarkable book, which I just finished a few days ago, that my life has sort of paralleled the life of Pendle Hill. I was born in 1928, so I was 2 years old when it was founded. But I was fortunate enough, even in my early years, to know some of the people that have been memorialized here. I knew Howard and Anna, and I was here when Parker Palmer flourished. And this book really has been a wonderful experience for me to realize how much I gained from my time here at Pendle Hill and from the influence of the people that had come before and after. And I'm deeply grateful to Doug Gwyn for doing some remarkable research. It's a tour de force, I think, in looking at Pendle Hill from a very fresh perspective. I have now come to realize that the personalist emphasis that you gave to the way in which this place has nurtured people has been part of my life and my journey. And I just can't praise you enough for sharing this and creating this wonderful document.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate those words from somebody who has held Pendle Hill as close to his heart as anyone has, and gave as tirelessly and richly of yourself as you did. I really enjoyed our conversations as I was researching the book, and it helped at several points, and so thank
you. I don't think I'll throw it, Joan. My aim isn't that good.
I'm really glad you talked about Jack Shepherd. I've actually never met him, but I read the Black City Stage, I think is the Pendle Hill pamphlet, and I wished I knew more about it, but I was serving in the Metropolitan Christian Council in Philly and met Nokomis Wood, who was probably my age, I don't know, African-American woman and very prominent in the community in Philadelphia. And she, I don't know how we got started talking about it, but she said the experience she had in some kind of workshop with Jack Shepherd, and I was curious, did you see anything about a workshop that dealt with the African-American community, or could you have been part of the other one you were talking about?
And I do give some attention to that in the book. I do talk about that in the book. He shortly after arriving here, I think Jack, I can't remember whether that was before he started teaching in '66 or working for the AFSC, doing improvisational theater with black youth at the Wharton Center in the city. And apparently had a great time. They did a reworking of the old medieval Everyman play under the title of "Time to Go, Joe," and about mortality. And here was Jack coming from London, and not having much of a sense of the nuances of race relations in America. But just being real and being a co-creator with the group. He said when we were improvising working out improvisations together, we were a group. When I tried to teach, the curtain would go down between us. but he just through humility and playful working with the group, he just did apparently some wonderful things. Black City Stage is one of the Pendle Hill pamphlet series. Well worth reading as well. Thank you, Joan, for lifting that up.
Thank you, Doug. One of the distinctive things about this place is the daily morning meeting for worship for 85 years, uninterrupted. What role do you think the daily meeting for worship has played in how transformative Pendle Hill has been? I
think it's crucial, and certainly, I can say this I know experimentally. Paraphrase George Cox. It has been a very deepening experience for me in the years that I've been here. That Benedictine formula of that Pendle Hill borrowed. I'm not sure whose idea that was, but the work, worship, and study. How those three interact in personal transformation is something really remarkable. So I'm glad it continues. Anything you want to add on that? Okay.
I was wondering when you read, a number of different things. Like Dan Wilson, I guess, wrote memoirs about this place.
Yeah.
Eleanor Price Mather's book. I remember Mary Howard when she was here, and I was on the staff at the time, she gave me, now here's the real history of Pendle. And so
I never found that one.
Yeah, well,
I looked around, but yeah.
I was told I should read that one to know the real story. So I'm wondering whether those you've read and how did you reconcile the different histories from different people?
There usually weren't differences, outright contradictions between them. People lifted up different things sometimes from the same event. Okay. It was mostly just adding more detail and texture and dimension to events.
Okay. Yeah. Much of it's myth,
But Dan Wilson's memoir of his Pendle Hill years, The Spirit of Pendle Hill, which was never published, but it's a big, thick manuscript. Should be in our library, and it's full of wonderful anecdotes that I lifted with credit in the book. Yeah. Including a wonderful story that I love to tell of when Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, visited Pendle Hill in 1958. At least I think it was 58 because he was at the Institute for Advanced. Well, no, it was at Princeton anyway in 1958 as a visiting scholar. Came over because he wanted to meet Howard Brinton. He admired Howard Brinton's doctoral thesis and book on Jakob Böhme, the German mystic. And so he came to just to see Howard Brinton. And as Dan tells the story, he was down in the Furbank basement fixing some plumbing at the time. This is a tradition. I don't know whether you've done any plumbing work in the place yet or not, but you'll get to it eventually, I'm sure. But, anyway, he was working on something, and Peter Docilli came running over to Furbank from Main House saying, "Did you know, come and see the Boomer. He's over in Main House." And Dan, he says, "I have to admit, all I could think to say was, what's a boober?" And so he had never heard of Martin Buber, and so he followed Peter Docilli back over, and there was Martin Buber sitting on the rug in front of the fireplace in the living room in the main house, telling Hasidic tales to a spellbound group of Pendle Hillers, and that was the moment at which Dan Wilson became a fervent disciple of Martin Buber's teaching.
Thank you so much. We'll have an opportunity to talk to Doug at a book table where he will be signing copies of his book, which you are welcome to purchase at FGC Quaker Books at Pendle Hill. We're so delighted that they are here with a full-service bookstore at Pendle Hill. Yes! Let's hear it for that. Also, some of Doug's other books are available if you have not read them. So they're available also. But what I would like to do is to remind you about our auction and to introduce the story of our auction. Julian Gwyn not only stands behind the camera but edits and produces some extraordinarily wonderful video. And there's a very short video introduction to lure you into the art studio to view it, or at least online to see what we have to offer and the work that's been done. So Julian, can you step forward and do that for just a moment?
This year is Pendle Hill's 85th anniversary, and back in 2011 we had the incident of Hurricane Irene coming up the coast, and we had a large limb in our state champion American beech that had a crack, so we proactively removed the branch so that it wouldn't do further damage to the tree. We had that lumber kiln dried and air drying so that we could hand it out to woodworkers that were volunteers building furniture for this 85th anniversary project.
My name is Steve Latta, and I've been a cabinet maker for about 35 years now. Well, I received a call from my new friends about this project, and I was very excited about it. And being a Quaker, it just seemed like a really great way to blend in. Combined with the fact that the beech tree was just spectacular and the wood gorgeous, it was just fun to do. Most of this wood was spalted, but it gave it great mineral streaks. I mean, you can see from examples the grain is just outrageous. The reason I chose to do a box, I thought the wood was just gorgeous for the top. I mean, the way the grain went going across it, and we see the grain echoed on the inside as well. And this is some of the most beautiful wood. The grain is just, it's on the bottom as well. It's just absolutely gorgeous. We have a really diverse collection of material here. It's a good mix of tables and chairs and benches, large items, small items. There's really traditional chair forms. It's just a good all-around mix.
Yeah, it's been said that the American beech on our property is as old as Quakerism. That William Penn, when he walked through the woods, would have seen this sapling growing in the woods. The value of this American beech is greater as a result of the age of the tree.
It's not necessarily just the piece. It's also the story that goes along with the piece. And this wood, because of its heritage, its history, it has a lot of value in that. This year, we're celebrating Pendle Hill's 85th anniversary. The Woodworkers Exhibition and Auction is to celebrate that event. You don't usually get the opportunity to work with wood that has such a rich history. Wood from the property itself. It's been registered in Pennsylvania as being one of the largest and oldest trees. This is your opportunity to help support Pendle Hill and get a piece of that history. Click on the link below to register for the auction. There's over 60 pieces here by some 30 to 40 woodworkers from Kentucky, Ohio, New England, Delaware, and of course, local friends of Pendle Hill. For 2 weeks, you'll have an opportunity to bid on these pieces starting on the 5th. We really hope you help do your part.
And now, if you could remove these items from the table, it is time for us to have a celebratory moment with cake and singing.
So I'd like to invite up Tom to help. They're good at cutting things.